We are blessed to have three wonderful speakers join us today to provide us a bit of context for this workshop. First is Blaise Agüera. He is a distinguished scientist here at Google and the leader of our organization, research organization. And some example contributions you might have seen publicly is mobile nets, federated learning, of course. Second is Dominowska. She is a director in our organization, and in particular, she's leading health research initiatives that she will be speaking about. And then there's Daniel Ramage, who is leading the federated learning team here at Google, and I'm sure many of you have met before. With that, Blaise, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marco. And thank you to everyone who is organizing. I'm sharing my screen. Is it visible? All right. I unfortunately, when I'm full screening, I also can't see thumbs ups. So I'm going to assume the answer is yes, unless somebody interrupts me. I want to just kick off the day by acknowledging the elephant or the dragon in the room. Where do we get off talking about privacy at Google anyway? And also, Marco has already done this, but perhaps before we get into that, to acknowledge the fact that we're living through a unique time in the lifetime of anyone alive today. And I'm not only talking about the pandemic. The pandemic that we're experiencing right now, I sometimes worry is only the first wave or the first species that we're going to experience quite a number of over the coming years due to shifting disease ranges and other sort of climate conditions. It's also a time of unmasked racism and other kinds of structural inequalities that's hardly new. But the level of awareness and attention being finally given to that after centuries is something that I believe we haven't seen before, not even in the time of the civil rights movement in the U.S. Also, we're living through a time of concentration of wealth and power that is unprecedented since the Gilded Age, since the time before any of us were alive. Also, we're living through a period of rise in authoritarianism and nationalism, which pose existential threats to any kind of liberal values or the kind of freedom and democracy and liberalism that we have come to associate with the ideas of progress, both social progress, technical progress, every other kind of progress. Also, we're living through a period of virtualization. The fact that we're conducting this meeting in this way is obviously relevant. There was this trope that was around in Silicon Valley for many years of when are we all going to get uploaded? When are people's brains going to be in jars or minds going to be uploaded into computers? The reality is that we've already been uploaded. If we rewind the clock by only 10 or 15 years, most of our social interactions and most of our lives were being lived out IRL in meat space, and that has completely turned on its head, really just in the last decade, and that the fact that all of those interactions are digitally mediated is very significant. So, you don't need to genetically engineer yourself to look like something else if you can look like something else online, because that's the majority of your interactions anyway. Also, we're living through a time of very rapid advance in AI. I'm sure many of you, all of you probably have seen, what's the recent experiments with GPT-3. That's just, the sort of latest iteration of extraordinary capabilities, really. We can always critique them and say they don't do this, they don't do that. There's this and that problem with them. Sure, they haven't woken up yet. They're not conscious. But we certainly have the ability to do things with computer technology today that seemed well outside the province of what was going to be possible with computers. Again, a decade or so ago, and that's an unprecedented change. And finally, we're in a period of accelerating climate collapse and mass migrations. ProPublica released a study just a couple of days ago with the New York Times about what the consequences are going to be in the Americas of climate-induced migration of people who are leaving their homes because they can no longer grow enough food to sustain life. As desertification happens in the equator, and the conditions for human and plant and animal life change more rapidly than we can adapt, we are going to see some really tough times in the century ahead. So, sorry to begin the day on a bit of a perhaps downer, but there are connections among all of these issues, and those connections are I believe actually quite integral to the subject of today's and tomorrow's get together. A lot of them have to do with equity and power relations, and with imbalances in those things, and that really is at the heart of what we're talking about today. Cognitive dissonance. In the field of psychology, cognitive dissonance occurs when a person holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values, or participates in an action that goes against one of these three and experiences psychological stress because of that. According to this theory, when two actions or ideas are not psychologically consistent with each other, people do all in their power to change them until they become consistent. I think that David Evans invoked the idea of cognitive dissonance in his presentation last year. About meaningful privacy for federated learning, and the irony of having that conversation at Google. As he put it, the problem with the dragon, after all, is not its stockpile stewardship, but its appetite. He was also referencing The New Wilderness by Maciej Ceglowski, both very short essays, very well worth reading, and I want to acknowledge these things. It's a little bit like I don't know, like ExxonMobil holding a conference about solar energy or something, as I'm sure they have. Now, to address first the narrowest point that David raised, security is important, but this talk and workshop mostly are about privacy, not security. We do work, in fact, on phone security in our team, but this pivot from privacy to security is an old trope that I think is best left behind. It's kind of typified by a conversation that I had with a longtime Googler very shortly after I joined Google in 2014 and started the team that works on federated learning and on these technologies. This Googler said to me, "Why do you want to work on device machine learning, on device inference, distributed learning, and all of this? The data center is much more secure than the phone." And he was right, of course. Google's data center is one of the most secure, perhaps the most secure. Fingers crossed every time I say that, of course. The data center is much more secure than other data centers, and it's much more secure than Android phones, for sure. But of course, the issue with this line of argument is immediately clear when you begin to look at it. First of all, the security of the data center and of the phone are multiplicative. That's one of the reasons that we're working on Android device security, from the hardware through the operating system through the experience. If the phone is compromised, then it doesn't matter if the data center is secure or not, because your information in the data center is compromised as well via the phone. Second, lawful intercept. And this really starts to unpack the issues that relate to what happens when you think about rights to access devices. So lawful intercept is the process whereby governments assert the right to inspect private user information. And whenever things are being run as services, the way that works at the moment is that the government asserts the right to be able to inspect those things under conditions X, Y, and Z. And those conditions have been resulting in an increasing amount of such lawful intercept activity over time, as governments become more tech savvy, more aware of what is possible to do, more aware of the honeypots that are sitting there in data centers. Silovsky's ambient privacy, or what David called big P privacy, is not just about security, not about security at all, in fact, but about a sense that one has that when one is living one's life, that life is a life with a certain amount of what Daniel Dennett would have called elbow room, of free will, of lack of chilling effects, of the ability to comport oneself in a way that that isn't constrained by the gaze of the continual gaze of a powerful other that comes along with unknown consequences down the line. Those others can be governments, of course. They can be surveillance in the kind of East Germany sense, or they can be other forms of surveillance of the kind that Shoshana Zuboff talks about in surveillance capitalism. But either way, the privacy that we need to be talking about is the privacy that means individual freedom and agency, the sense that you can live your life in the ways that in the freer societies on Earth we have become used to, that we preserve that for the future. This statement, the data center is much more secure than the phone, is a comment that's very strongly situated from the inside in a lack of social imagination. Only somebody working at Google could have made that comment, because that person was thinking about my data center, my phone. The lack of transparency into what's going on in the data center, the lack of understanding of what data might be joined with what, where it might go, what might happen with it, is structural, and that comes along with feeling a lack of agency about what happens with data once it has moved into that world outside of one's own, not only control, but one's ability to even model socially. So it's not about the device versus the data center in the end. It's really about Google versus not Google. To expand a little bit on this Google versus not Google point, I want to draw a little bit on my history at Microsoft, which is where I worked for the 7 years before the previous 7 years that I've been working at Google. Microsoft was hardly a very trusted company for most of its history. Maybe it's more trusted now that many people feel that it's been largely defanged and turned into a kind of IBM. But back in the day of antitrust lawsuits and consent decrees and whatnot, Microsoft was a very untrusted company, a company that was thought of as being extraordinarily mercenary, no holds barred. At the same time as that was happening, it was selling its operating systems, word processors, and whatnot to governments, to companies that competed directly with it, to secret intelligence agencies all over the world. So it's interesting, right, that it's simultaneously kind of regarded as an untrustworthy entity, and yet that the things that it made, its tools, were relied on completely. There was no sense that when you wrote a document with Microsoft Word, that Microsoft was somehow looking at that document. Despite the fact that, structurally speaking, Microsoft had written the word processor, they had written the networking stack, they had written the operating system. So certainly there was nothing structurally preventing them from having a skeleton key and being able to inspect all of those things. But that's not how Microsoft presented what it was doing, nor was it how they made what they made. They were making tools. When they put capabilities, including AI-ish capabilities insofar as they existed at the time, like grammar and spell checking or whatever, they never talked, even internally, about that in terms of, we know what you're writing, we know when you misspell something, we correct it for you. Because that we would imply that Microsoft is able to see those things, that Microsoft is the actor doing the correcting. And Microsoft was never the actor. Microsoft was the tool maker. It was it that did the correcting, it that recognized when something was not capitalized or was misspelled. So, that's a very different sort of social setup than the one in which everything is run in a kind of hub and spokes model as a service provider. I mentioned Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism. For those of you who haven't read the book, it's worth at least a skim. And the way she defines surveillance capitalism is a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. Or a parasitic economic logic in which the production of goods and services is subordinated to a new global architecture of behavior modification. Or a rogue mutation of capitalism marked by concentrations of wealth, knowledge, and power, unprecedented in human history. There are a few more definitions. And finally, an expropriation of critical human rights that is best understood as a coup from above, an overthrow of the people's sovereignty. So, Zuboff is going beyond just the chilling arguments, or saying that, we feel bad, we feel chilled when we feel like we're being surveilled, and going on to say that we're in a kind of cybernetic feedback loop in which even our very behavior is being controlled by the feedback from these kinds of models and systems. And that takes this kind of imbalance of knowledge, imbalance of power based on the possibility of unforeseen consequences later on, and turns the crank up even further and says we're at risk of becoming marionettes, essentially, even in our moment-to-moment actions. I think that the charge is certainly provocative. It's forward-looking. I don't believe that we are marionettes yet, but I think that it's a critical wake-up call. So, researchers and engineers at Google, certainly don't literally have the power to control the behavior of the human population, but we do have the power to think about alternative technologies and business models, and to redesign Google's systems. And that's the reason personally that I'm here at Google. It's because I felt like this was a position structurally from which it was possible and essential to do these things. We, of course, are facing moments of impending regulation on privacy and on AI and on other things from governments and from other bodies. And as far as I'm concerned, that's great, because the threat of regulation is what will get Google and many other companies to invest, to change, to try and do the right things preemptively. Of course, regulation that isn't done in a way that is aware of what is possible, of an understanding of not only the trade-offs, but the possibilities for avoiding trade-offs by having yes and kind of solutions. Such regulation will be dumb regulation. So, part of the point also is to get ahead of the regulation by actually prototyping and designing systems that can achieve yes and sorts of results, like federated learning, so that they can be taken into account when those regulations are written and babies aren't thrown out with bathwater. Competition is also critical, of course. Every company is extremely sensitive to what every other company is doing. And to the extent that we are sharing and talking about these technologies and making them public, that's great in part because many other companies are going to be doing the same sorts of work. And we form a community of change across companies, including ones that are in strong competition with each other. I'm thinking, of course, of in our case of Facebook and Apple. And a couple of other competitive companies, and also various organizations in China that are starting to look very, very hard at federated learning. Standards are powerful because they allow, as with encryption, for one to define baselines or approaches that interoperate. And of course, research and publishing in the open source community are critical, again, as with encryption, in order to make the claims that some of these systems have verifiable. And ideally, those are complemented by things like attestation and other forms of security on the code, so that those claims can be backed up with evidence. So. This is more or less my last slide, but I want to try and tie together some of the thoughts that I've just been sharing. The problems of treating trustworthy systems, or the idea of sharing in some kind of abstract way, are myriad. It's not a I hate the way the word share is generally used by companies in Silicon Valley, as if consent to surveillance is sharing. It's an abuse of the term. Trust also, I think we use too lightly. Trust is a social construct. Trust started with people trusting or not trusting each other in certain contexts and in the performance of certain duties or certain obligations, or trusting somebody with certain kind of information in the context of gossip networks and so on. And we've extended this social modeling of trust in other human beings to include aggregates or abstractions, like institutions and companies and political parties and countries. And the formation of those abstractions has been critical to forming human society and to being able to advance in the ways that we have. And so in a sense, when we talk about things like trust, we're making use of a kind of natural interface, and a natural social interface, if you like, and extending it to these more abstract entities. The trouble is that when those entities become so large, so unbalanced, and so hard to model socially that you no longer understand what it means to, I don't know, trust Google with my location history, for example, then it leads to that state of disempowerment and chilling that we talked about earlier. The idea also that you can trade individual liberty for collective action, and that the two are opposed to each other. That, in other words, that you can either have your own sort of libertarian agency, or you can have collective effective action, I believe is a false dichotomy. This idea of individual liberty and collective action together has been really kind of elaborated on by a number of authors. Nicholas Christakis' Blueprint comes to mind. Or The Secret of Our Success is another very good book that talks about this. We need structures and institutions in order to guarantee our individual liberties, and in order to provide platforms for those individual liberties to actually be meaningful. We're not a race of individuals. We are a collective. We are a society. We're as much of a hive as we are individuals. And on the other hand, of course, if the power imbalances become too stark, if we become chilled, then we push back. And I think that some of the authoritarian tendencies and some of the extreme libertarian tendencies that we both see happening today are various forms of that kind of pushback. So when I talk about sort of what it means to have an actor network theory of privacy, what I mean is that rather than having just a hub and spokes in which Google, say, is a giant entity that is either trusted or not trusted in the center, and everything is done as a service, we need to start to understand a future world of people, devices, and institutions that looks more like a graph that is a bit less uneven, a bit less clumpy, in which all of those different edges involve trust relationships of different kinds. And so if there's an automatic door, that has a camera on it, then there needs to be a sort of space for the legibility of what that camera is doing. That it's just looking for people and avoiding opening the door and letting out the cool air for a dog walking by or something like this. If that legibility is absolutely clear, this is what it's doing. It is an individual actor doing this. That's very, very different in terms of the social modeling of trust than if I think, sure, that door is opening and closing, but that camera is logging into a central database somewhere. Everybody who walks by, and who knows what that information is going to get used for later. So we need to start thinking about actor network theory as opposed to trust or either surveillance or disconnection. As two sort of extremes. That's not how an ecology works. And just as concrete examples of why such ecological thinking is so critical, COVID tracing is exactly a situation in which we cannot just say everybody's liberty and freedom means that there is never any coordination of information among devices. But by using some of the kinds of technologies that we're talking about now, we can both have the collective benefits that we need, and also have the individual freedom of action and lack of chilling that we need. But it's only by taking that very difficult technical road of solving for both at the same time that we can achieve those results. The same is true of the rising calls for end-to-end encryption and messaging, together with the need to collectively learn in order to address things like anti-phishing. The more and more phishing attacks are being done through messaging and messaging is more and more end-to-end encrypted. So, that means that the companies that are that make the devices, that make the messaging apps, cannot themselves look into the messages and understand what's a phishing message, and that's a good thing. But then there has to be some kind of collective intelligence that is understanding what those phishing messages are and making those endpoints, those nodes, intelligent about how to recognize phishing. It's not either or. We need to go for both. So I think that I've more than exhausted my time. I'm going to end here. I will also mention that in addition to federated learning, of course, one of the really critical advances that I see over the next decade is better AI that doesn't require as much data in order to learn. In the same sense that when a person is learning how to drive a car, they don't have to crash the car 10,000 times in order to learn how not to do that. One would hope that as we advance in AI more broadly, we don't require the kind of vast amounts of information, sort of Skinnerian style, conditioning, in order to do a lot of the kinds of learning that today require very large amounts of data. So that's sort of the parallel thrust with a lot of the work that we've been talking about. And I will end there. Sorry for running a bit over.
Thank you, Blaise. We'll be taking questions at the end. Please enter your questions into the dory. You'll find a link in the chat box on the right side or upper right corner. And the next Eva will sort of explain how these challenges that Blaise was alluding to manifest themselves in the health space and the health research domain. Eva, please take it away.
Thank you, Blaise. Welcome, everyone. So to further ground the need for federated computational techniques, I'll talk about its potential use in the health space. So I will touch on just 3 different areas where FL can possibly benefit health research. And just kind of a quick note, I'll use FL to mean federated computation more broadly and federated analytics, not just federated learning. So why FL and health? Mobile devices and wearable sensors are providing an unparalleled view into a person's mental and health state. We are seeing everyone carrying their phone almost everywhere. The phone usage is really growing. As you heard from Marco and Blaise, like today we're in a really unprecedented time. Health is on everyone's mind. We are surrounded by digital devices, and this has kind of become even more front and center. At the same time, the data that is our behavior and data that could be collected from for these devices is extremely privacy sensitive, and the implications on health of that data are even more privacy sensitive. Federated computation enables large-scale learning on statistical models and data while preserving user privacy. So the benefits of learned models can later be passed down back to individuals, but impact impact large communities. So as Blaise mentioned, this tension that many people think exists between impact on individuals and large communities, FL can actually help us solve some of that tension and get benefit both for individuals and large communities while preserving the individual privacy. So privacy first clinical research. Why is this an area that we're investing in? This is not really uncharted territory. There is a lot of examples in clinical research that use randomized response techniques and try to preserve user privacy. A lot of studying and techniques, it's proven that a lot of those techniques actually enhance user trust and lead to higher quality data and higher quality results. This allows us to really design the research questions up front and not investigate areas that haven't received user consent. So federated learning and analytics are an alternative to traditional centralized data collection, and they enable aggregate insights and analytics in basically collected in a private way, yet getting those insights. So differential privacy and secure aggregation protect the individual contributions. So really, most importantly, there's two large benefits that we get from federated analytics. Federated analytics lowers the bar to initiate collection. We can get access to highly sensitive signals that today are not available, such as keystrokes, ambient audio, mobility data. We also can get access to really initiate some of that research without sacrificing privacy. So a challenge for clinical research today is its sensitivity, and the bar to start the research is very high, yet a lot of clinicians are not familiar with the technology, are not familiar with the privacy and security techniques, and FL, and especially FL as a platform, unlocks a lot of those capabilities for the researchers. Another large benefit is just unlocking a larger pool of users and a more diverse set of users. So users often change their behavior when they know they're being observed, the Hawthorne effect, and many participants just don't want to participate in those studies because of the sacrifice of privacy. One area that has been recently emerging is clinical research. It is really the holy grail of clinical research is continuous monitoring. At the same time, this is really hard to achieve. Most medical devices are cumbersome and awkward, and participants do not want to carry medical devices. Any other way of continuous data collection is very challenging. At the same time, all of us carry our phones with us, which allows for unlocking continuous monitoring through digital phenotyping. However, a big challenge in that area is developing that in a way that allows for trust, privacy, and equity. Federated learning and federated analytics gives us that opportunity. Another sensitive topic or kind of sensitive data that is very critical for a lot of clinical studies is around data, is around location as well as mobility. So smartphone GPS signals enable high resolution spatial maps for epidemiological surveillance. Yet the location data is very sensitive and private. At the same time, you can build very detailed maps that leverage secure aggregation and preserve user privacy through the use of federated analytics and through algorithms such as secure aggregation, and can build on top of the existing research on heavy hitters, range queries, and hierarchical methods. So here's an example of reconstructing a detailed collected map using the heavy hitter algorithm, and you can see that it's very easy to still find the hotspots without sacrificing the user privacy. Another area that is top of mind for all of us nowadays is COVID and prevention of COVID and kind of understanding the exposure. As you might know, Google and Apple recently launched exposure tracking framework that can be used to build exposure notification apps. So the way that the exposure notification works is if you're interacting with someone that, whether that's a stranger or somebody you know, and that person later get that diagnosed, you're able to understand that you interacted with that person. If you know the person, it might be easy. They might actually call you and let you know that they've been exposed. But if you're interacting or in the presence of a stranger, then it's much harder to find out, and exposure notification through either exposure tracking or digital tracking allows users to actually understand that they've been exposed. And in this case, federated learning allows, or kind of federated computation techniques unlock access to relevant exposure features such as duration, distance, indoor-outdoor mask usage, and can provide information that somebody has been exposed in a way that still preserves the privacy of everyone that is being monitored through such a system. Another area where federated computation can be very beneficial is in understanding sleep and the impact of sleep on our life. So the circadian rhythm can be very impactful on everyone's life and ability to function. And there is a lot of devices that do sleep monitoring. But there is very little work and research that ties the impact of sleep quality to daily lives, as well as the impact of daily lives back to sleep quality. So federated learning and federated computation on understanding sleep and its effects can be done in a way that gives us detailed information of how exercise or phone usage or environment can impact sleep, and similarly how sleep can impact your effectiveness during the following day, and kind of we can understand how both the causality of environmental and behavioral signals on sleep, as well as the impact of sleep on people's daily lives. So I also want to mention a few open challenges and research areas. With use of federated computation in clinical research is really a new area, and clinicians often don't understand how it works, why it works, and why and how it should be used. So we need to provide better tooling, APIs. We need to allow traditional models to work well on in federated settings. So there is a lot of research that still needs to happen in this area. Also modeling and optimization strategies. It's important for the data sets to be balanced, and we need to understand the impact of sampling and how data is aggregated, and provide model interpretability. And finally, there is a lot of infrastructure improvements around just maximizing participation, handling multiple devices per user, and privacy accounting. So I'll stop here. This is a very broad area with a lot of research that still needs to be done, and I'll hand it off to Dan to give you a deeper dive into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's exciting to see virtually so many folks who were also here with us last year. I wanted to, oops, back up a few slides to the start. Yes, there we go. I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of just kind of in this big arc of what motivates from a very big picture why we care about federated learning, and in this context of privacy and the kinds of applications in health that we think we can now start to tackle in ways that are safe because of those technologies. I wanted to give you kind of a flavor of just more concretely in the nuts and bolts, the technical problems that we need solved from an infrastructure perspective and from an academic perspective. Those are the things that, you know, when the rubber hits the road, those are the problems that need to be solved to enable these things. And this is one of the areas where the academic work from you partners in this burgeoning field is just so essential for us. When we think about federated technologies at Google, you know, we've been working on this for the last few years. In 2017, we wrote about in the Google AI blog around about our initial explorations into whether it's possible to do training and learning. And in that setting, we've been trying to bring those more and more into Google products, because every time we bring it into a Google product, it's good for the privacy of the users that are using that particular Google product, but it also tells us a lot more about what real problems actually need to get solved next. It anchors our research in what matters for turning these ideas that are really nice in theory to actually having a practical impact in the world. Some of you might have seen our blog post from May this year about federated analytics, which was in some sense a simpler problem. This is more about collecting statistics about things and less about learning deep nets. But these problems have also really interesting algorithmic foundations and a deep history outside of Google, but tons of practical applications for some of the problems that Eva alluded to and others that are needed by teams who actually want to use federated technologies to make products better. So we really kind of think about like these two parties, users and the engineers. These are the humans that we think about when we're trying to build systems that use federated technologies. The users we're trying to provide better services to, and the engineers, we need to make it so that the tools are practical and they can actually use these technologies to do their job of making those products and services better. So we think about this as a workflow, and that engineer needs good tools to work with the decentralized data set, not just to train a single model, but to do the whole workflow of machine learning, to train many models, to see which ones are better and worse, to debug those models when they break, and to do all of that with strong privacy guarantees is really our aspiration. I'm not going to talk about the things that we focus on, because I'm going to try to get us back on enough time to have a couple questions from the Dory, but many of these will come up in their talks over the next couple days, and aspects of them come out in the breakout sessions. I'm also not going to talk about the scale of the systems we're running today, but you know, here are some numbers. This is a slice of traffic. There's a lot of devices. They're checking in a lot. We have a lot of practical understanding now of the dynamics of this cross-device federated learning setting. Not the cross-silo setting, which is also quite popular in, say, the medical domain. This is really the setting that we care the most about. Is this really massive device scale, although we're interested in both. We have pretty graphs like this, and we have pretty state transition diagrams like this, which I also won't tell you about, but this is just giving a sense of like our understanding of the behavior of what actually happens when devices try to do this compute. Where do they go? You know, they don't all just complete. We can't just assume that the devices in the real world act the way we would like them to from a theoretical perspective. So I'll leave you on one thought. This field has been growing like crazy. This is a very, very approximate paper count. Many of you know because you've been contributing to these paper counts. This 2020 is like a half year. I don't know how high that bar is going to go, but this curve is kind of special. I think this is an area that's hot, which is cool, but it also matters. And I think that that's a nice intersection. Thanks to everybody who contributed last year to this Advances in Open Problems paper. Many of you were co-authors who had joined us last year, and many of you are new. Thank you for joining this year. This, if you haven't seen it, is a great kind of sketch for many of the things we'll be talking about over the next couple days. And with that, I'll say thank you for joining us. Welcome. There's a comic book you can share with your friends that most of you have seen already, but if anybody's like, what is federated learning? That's a good thing to point them to. And we'll hear more later this session about TensorFlow Federated.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Eva and Blaise as well. With that, we're happy to take some questions. And again, there's a Dory link in the chat box on the screen. That will be the best way to register your questions. But I'm also happy to take some questions live here if somebody wants to speak up while I pull up the Dory. Perhaps let me lead in with one question for the panel. That now that you have a virtual room with many academics here, and where do you see the academic research could make the greatest contribution to these challenges that you have outlined?
I'll jump in with one answer. I mean, I think one of the things that has been really interesting for us is to see where are the potential problems that we don't know, and what are the solutions to those problems. I mean, both of those are just really important. There's a whole line of work on attacks and defenses, but there's also a lot of depth that people can go into sort of within the space of algorithmic approaches that are practical from a systems perspective. There's so much interesting theoretical and work that can be done there that can really inform the next generation of the kinds of systems that we want to deploy to make these things, real. We read the papers that you write, and we take those ideas and build on them as much as we can.
I want to just, everything Dan said. Also, bounds. Really working on the theory side of this, and in particular, all of the different kinds of work on how we think about bounds and guarantees. Seems to me like an area that's still, we still have a lot of work to do collectively as an academic area.
For the clinical research, obviously, one area that's very important is understanding the representativeness of the population that is being included in the abrogation. So that would probably be one large area. And then just the transparency and legibility and bringing understanding why these techniques are preserving privacy, both to the users and the researchers doing the clinical research. I think there's still some confusion on how FL works in the broad public eye and why it works.
Thank you all. And we have the Dory on the screen now. There's a comment from David Evans who says, thanks a bunch for the mention. I think that's directed to Blaise's intro slides, and a link for the full talk to anybody who wants to know more. The next question is from Monica. I think she's one of our interns here at Google. Thanks for chiming in. And thanks for great insights. With federated learning, the user is on her own to judge the results of an AI system, from great health recommendations, but also potentially fake news. How can we create awareness among users to interpret the results from the system and use the information they receive responsibly?
So one of the things that I think, Monica, your question really highlights is the way this is not just a technical problem, and that was sort of the one of the main themes that I think both Eva and I talked about quite a bit this morning. This is a socio-technical problem, a socio-technical systems problem. So we can do all of the wonderful work that we can as researchers, proving bounds, making systems that are robust, that can resist all sorts of attack, attempts by different kinds of actors and so on. But all of that is really only addressing a part of the socio-technical, kind of suite of problems that we need to deal with, and many of them have a lot to do with folk theories, with regulations, with user experience, with where these systems are actually showing up and what problems they're being used to solve, and how all of that is being communicated and by whom and in what setting. So it's a huge question. I mean, there's no short answer, but what I would encourage is for us all to not only think with our academic paper publishing hat on, but to really think about the whole socio-technical problem as much as we can.
Thank you. With that, we're on top of the hour. I'll open it up once more with a last chance to ask live questions.
There's actually a question from Adam Smith. He asks, to what extent are we creating a false sense of security by promoting decentralized learning as automatically providing privacy? How extensively are we limiting claims of protection to clear and refutable statements? Is there a danger that umbrella terms like FL conflate different issues?
Yes. Sorry to jump right back in, but I worry about this all the time. To the extent that we're trying to do something that like encryption, right, that you can really rest weight on, and trust. There is the very real risk, and I know we're going to experience this attack vector, if you like, over the next year, that the brand will get polluted, essentially, right? That there'll be all kinds of bullshit claims, either about these techniques being used in places where they're not, or about guarantees that we aren't actually able to make. So it's a huge issue, and again, social technical problem. I think that would be a really rich and useful discussion, and one that is clearly not going to be soluble by Google or any other company acting on its own, right? It's going to have to be really like a very broad-based sort of consortium discussion approach, and ultimately, I hope, standardization or regulation as well.
And this is also an area where it's nice if people who've heard of this thing have a vague positive fuzzy association that means privacy. Obviously, that doesn't mean privacy. The story is never that simple. And I think it's really important to have a full kind of line of depth for somebody who's an uninformed user to becoming more informed, to becoming more of an expert. Maybe they're an expert in software, they can see open source. Maybe they're an expert in policy, they can understand how this relates to governance models. Maybe there's an expert in privacy and they can look into the academic work. It's really important for there to be every link in that chain that anyone can go deeper. That won't prevent the misuse and abuse of these terms to try to get some of the glow of that halo, if that halo exists. But it's really important to inoculate against that misuse to the extent we can by having every link in that chain from an uninformed association of positivity, hopefully, to something that's really grounded in specific claims about technology as it's deployed and governed.
And provability of some of those claims as well.
Exactly.
This is why attestation, open source, secure tool chains, et cetera, are also really, really critical to this whole story. That's where privacy and security do connect.
Let's just give a very quick take on these two last questions. First, Eva, when you say people want to understand representativeness, do you mean post facto or even guiding the selection of participants to ensure representativeness?
Even guiding the selection of the participants. So, because ultimately we need to, for clinical research, we often study very small effects. So we need more research in how the distribution should be scheduled and synchronized as an open area of research.
Mm-hmm. And Molly asks, any thoughts on how to teach practitioners how to adopt or consider federated learning technology? Any lessons so far from Google's experience in this direction?
I think maybe there's a lot there. Maybe that would be a good topic for a future talk, not this year. But I think the tutorials in TFF are going to be a really good kind of distillation of how we think one should think about that problem from the outside. There's a whole bunch of related issues about practical deployments for the on-device settings that we care about at Google that are not going to be covered in that talk. But I think for the parts that are actually reproducible without having a fleet of devices, that those tutorials are probably a pretty good distillation. They're our best attempts so far.
Thank you again. With that, let's close the session, and thank you for giving us this overview, starting at the broad societal context, some concrete challenges in the health domain, and how we are trying to address this with federated learning at Google.